Joined by Congressman Michael Waltz, Republican of Florida, another member of the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee. The Congressman, two callers ago, the caller was talking about the best way to invest in space, and he said air defense is the best investment we can make in space. Can you talk through some of the national security threats that you see in space as both a member of this committee and as a member of the Armed Services Committee as well?
Sure, yeah. So being on the Armed Services Committee and the Space Committee, I have oversight over the military portion, the Air Force, the National Reconnaissance Office with our intelligence community, but also NASA, NOAA, and the civilian components. And let me be very clear here. We are being challenged and will be challenged by the Chinese and the Russians in space in the 21st century. Both countries have explicitly said in their national security strategy that if we ever come to any type of conflict, they are not going to defeat us by sinking aircraft carriers or taking on tank and fighter to fighter. They're going to take us down by taking out the infrastructure in space that all of those entities depend on. All of the satellite, all of the cameras, all of the communications and relay infrastructure that's up there. The Chinese have developed the capability and are continuing to develop the capability to destroy that, to jam it, to block it, to render it inoperable. So we have to be able to not only defend our assets, but also to be able to compete. And space is now a warfighting domain, and we're making the investments to be able to protect ourselves up there.
Should we be more concerned about China or Russia?
Right now, I am more in the present day, I'm concerned about Russia, but in the next 3 to 5 years, I'm concerned about China. China first demonstrated its ability to knock down our satellites in 2007 and have made it a specific priority in their military buildup to develop that capability. And why does that matter aside from a national security standpoint? Depending on how you estimate it, over $500 billion of our economy is dependent on space, and that's set to grow fourfold in the next 10 years. So banking, navigation, worldwide logistics, basically our entire modern economic infrastructure is dependent on what's up in space. However, it is old. It is not built to be defended. It's not redundant, meaning we don't have backup systems. How we're forecasting hurricanes, I mean, all of that is dependent on space. So think about it this way. Post-World War II, we created the Air Force to dominate space power in the 20th century. In the 21st century, we are on our way to creating the Space Force or Space Corps, some minor differences there, to dominate space power in the 21st century. It's absolutely critical.
I want to come back to Space Force, but with your concerns about Russia, do you think it is then a good idea that we are cooperating with them at the International Space Station and other cooperative efforts that we have when it comes to space exploration?
Yeah, I do. I mean, we could separate the military component from the science, the experimentation, and the other components that go on in the space station that actually bring over a dozen nations together. But here's the thing. The Chinese are creating their own space station. They're not going to cooperate with us on ours, and they're taking a step forward. They are looking to create a manned station on the moon. By the end of the next decade, the Chinese do not do anything in space that does not have a military component. They're not up there for the sake of exploration or the sake of experimentation. Everything they do has the People's Liberation Army stamp on it, and that is something we have to absolutely be aware of.
You mentioned Space Force a second ago. You've introduced legislation to establish a U.S. Space Command. What is that? Is that different than a Space Force?
That's slightly different. So the Space Force is going to be a separate branch of the military that gives it an equal seat at the table when it comes to resources in the Pentagon. The Space Command will be a combatant command like Cyber Command or Special Operations Command that pulls all of the force components, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, and actually all of the services have various space components together and operationalize those and basically treat space like cyberspace or like the Middle East as a warfighting domain where we pull all of the services together under a 4-star general.
And do we know how much that will cost?
Well, right now the initial estimates are about $72 million. That's for all of the personnel components and the initial infrastructure components. But again, we can't look at this as additional bureaucracy. We have to look at this as a service that is focused on the type of people, the type of acquisition, the type of equipment that we need to maintain our dominance in space, which we've had over the last several decades, but will be challenged going forward by our peer competitors.
Does it surprise you, the results of that poll that we conducted when it comes to Space Force specifically, some 33% finding support for Space Force, saying that they do support it, 30% saying that they don't support it, another 37% saying they have no opinion on it?
Yes and no. I think, if you look back to the moonshot and what President Kennedy did, he put $280 billion in today's dollars, the equivalent, towards the moon program back then. And that was a constant, I think, education process out to the public, to the Congress, to other detractors. But look at what we were able to do as a country. Look at the science and the inventions that I think we all take for granted today. Everything from scratch-resistant lenses to LED to Velcro to all CAT scans. I mean, the list goes on and on. The science and technological kickoffs from focusing the nation on achieving something like putting someone on the moon. I think we should and can do that again. And here's the thing, if we don't, other nations will. The Chinese, the Indians, the Israelis, and others are lined up to put men on the moon in the next few years. The United States, just as it does around the world, has to lead in space. And if we don't, we create a vacuum, others will.
And finally, in our last less than a minute or so, it's the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 launch. Just your thoughts on the legacy of that day and then 4 days later on the first lunar walk.
Well, if you look at I look at the human aspect of this, and you look at those astronauts who strapped themselves to a rocket and launched themselves with basically, without computers, with the computing power that they did have that was less than what we have in the iPhone, on calculations that were done on slide rules. It really was incredible. What I think what is more incredible is the unifying aspect of going to space and going to the moon and what it did for our country. And if you talk to people, I know you have on the show, who watched us land on the moon, who watched that incredible American achievement, I just think it was one of the seminal moments in American history, and it's a unifying factor that I think we can get back to when we're talking about American values, what it means to be a free American today, and taking those values to brave new worlds. Not only can we do that again, and should we do that again, but I think we're at a point where we have to defend what we're doing up in space and defend ourselves down in here on Earth. I can't emphasize it enough. Just as we enabled a liberal world order by dominating air power from a national security standpoint in the 20th century, we will have to do that by dominating space power in the 21st century. So there's the human aspect of this, but there's also the national security aspect, and they go hand in hand.
Michael Waltz is a U.S. Army officer, a Republican from Florida, a member of the Armed Services Committee, and a member of the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee. And we